When we picture ancient nomads, we imagine hunters chasing herds across endless plains, spears raised, fires blazing, survival hanging by a thread. But what if the real secret to their endurance wasn't the hunt, but the harvest? Hidden beneath their feet, growing in silence, and crawling in the smallest corners of the earth lay the foods that truly sustained them, a forgotten pantry of nature's genius. Long before supermarkets and storage shelves, indigenous nomads moved through landscapes that could turn from generous to merciless in a single season. Yet they thrived, not by chance, but by knowledge. They knew which roots to dig when snow sealed the plains, which mushrooms signaled safety, which seeds could feed a village no bigger than a handful. Every plant, every insect, every grain had a purpose. And together, they formed a diet so balanced it could outlast famine, frost, and fire. They fermented, dried, and ground their meals into compact powerhouses of nutrition. They discovered energy where modern science still hesitates to look. For them, food wasn't just sustenance. It was a living relationship with the land, a dialogue of respect and survival. Today, when our shelves overflow and yet our connection to food feels empty, their wisdom calls back through time, asking us to remember that survival is not about abundance, but awareness. Because the ancient nomads didn't live from the land, they lived with it. And in doing so, they uncovered a kind of nourishment we've forgotten how to taste. Subscribe now, because every day we bring history back to life, one forgotten survival secret at a time. When we talk about ancient nomads, the phrase hunter-gatherer often paints an incomplete picture. It suggests simplicity, a life of endless pursuit and chance. But the truth is far more sophisticated. The diets of indigenous nomads were not random collections of what nature offered. They were finely tuned systems of balance, adaptation, and intelligence, shaped by thousands of years of observation. Across deserts, forests, and tundra, these communities built menus that mirrored their environments. In the Arctic, they mastered fat-rich diets that preserved body heat. In the plains, protein met roots rich in minerals. In dry regions, seeds and tubers replaced what the soil could not give in abundance. Each group developed a local science of nourishment, one that modern nutrition only recently began to understand. Food was never just about filling the stomach. It was about balance between what the body needed and what the land could renew. Every edible plant, insect, or animal part had its place in the web of survival. Nomads learned to time their harvests with migration patterns, to leave enough behind for regrowth, and to prepare the earth for its next gift. Their diets were guided by relationship, not dominance. They listened to the land's rhythms, noting how plants tasted before storms, or how roots thickened before frost. Each discovery became part of a collective memory, passed through stories and songs that ensured no generation forgot how to eat wisely. In a world where we chase diets and superfoods, the ancient nomads already lived them, centuries before the words existed. Their strength came not from abundance, but from understanding. They didn't see food as a commodity. They saw it as a covenant, a promise between human and earth, written in every bite. Beneath the soil where footsteps barely left a trace, the true lifeline of ancient nomads lay hidden. Roots, tubers, and rhizomes, quietly storing the energy of the earth. While game animals moved with the seasons, these buried treasures remained steadfast, waiting patiently through frost and drought to feed those who knew where to look. The nomads learned early that the ground itself was a pantry. Wild potatoes, cattail roots, arrowhead tubers, and desert lilies became staples of their survival. Dug with sharpened sticks or hands hardened by labor, these roots were washed, roasted, or ground into pastes that provided lasting fuel. Cattail rhizomes, for example, were more than food. Their starch-rich fibers could be boiled into porridge or dried for storage, supplying energy long after the hunt had failed. But the brilliance of these foragers wasn't just in gathering, it was in transformation. They discovered that some roots needed soaking to remove bitterness, while others grew sweeter when roasted in buried stone pits. Their understanding of chemistry came not from textbooks, but from generations of trial, error, and intuition. In cold months, caches of dried roots were sealed in woven baskets and buried beneath layers of earth and bark, an ancient refrigeration system that defied time. When spring returned, these stores offered nourishment until the first greens emerged. Modern diets often overlook the humble root, but to indigenous nomads, it was the heartbeat of endurance. Beneath the frozen surface or the cracked desert clay, these plants held proof that survival is not about chasing what's visible. It's about trusting what lies unseen. Each dig into the soil was an act of gratitude, a reminder that even in the harshest places, the earth always keeps something alive for those who listen. In the shaded silence of forests and canyon walls, another kind of nourishment thrived, one that grew not in sunlight, but in decay. The ancient indigenous nomads understood that even what seemed lifeless could sustain life. Mushrooms, molds, and fermented foods became their quiet allies, transforming scarcity into strength through a kind of natural alchemy. They gathered mushrooms not by chance, but by knowledge, knowing which ones sprouted after rain, which nestled beneath cottonwoods, and which glowed faintly under rotting logs. These weren't just occasional finds, they were reliable sources of protein, minerals, and even medicine. Some were dried on flat stones near the fire, others strung together and hung from branches to preserve them for the coming cold. But perhaps their greatest genius was in fermentation, the unseen process that turned perishables into powerhouses. Roots and tubers were soaked and left to sour slightly, improving digestion and nutrient release. Seeds and berries were crushed, stored in tightly sealed pouches, and left to ferment into rich, probiotic pastes. What modern science calls preservation, the nomads understood as transformation, a way to make the body stronger by letting nature continue her work. In the forest, nothing was wasted. Fungi broke down the fallen, giving back to the soil. The people mirrored that balance, taking only what replenished itself and learning from the invisible cycle of decay and renewal. Fermentation wasn't a luxury or a curiosity. It was survival through understanding time. It meant turning the fleeting abundance of summer into the endurance of winter, proof that patience itself could become food. To the nomads, the forest floor was more than a hunting ground. It was a living laboratory, where the smallest organisms taught the greatest lesson, that life, even in stillness, is always becoming. Scattered across grasslands and desert valleys, the smallest things often carried the greatest power. To the ancient indigenous nomads, seeds were not mere garnish. They were life, condensed into dust. Tiny, resilient, and abundant, these grains became the foundation of their endurance, a quiet miracle beneath their feet. Where modern eyes saw weeds, they saw harvests. Wild amaranth, goosefoot, dropseed, and the ancestors of quinoa painted their landscapes in gold and green. Collected by hand or woven basket, these grains were winnowed, roasted, and ground between smooth stones into flours rich in protein and fiber. A single handful could sustain a traveler for miles, compact enough to carry, yet dense with energy. But the nomad's genius went deeper than gathering. It lay in patience and pattern. They learned when the seeds would loosen from the stalk, how wind direction aided collection, and how to burn fields lightly to help regrowth the following year. These weren't random habits. They were sustainable systems long before the word existed. In drier regions, these microcrops were mixed with crushed nuts or animal fat to form travel cakes, the earliest energy bars. Some were soaked in water to sprout, unlocking vitamins modern science would later praise. Others were stored in woven pouches sealed with resin, lasting through months of migration. Each seed told a story of adaptability, tiny vessels that thrived where large crops could not. And as the nomads moved, they carried these seeds across continents, quietly shaping the biodiversity of the lands they touched. For them, nourishment wasn't measured in size or luxury. It was found in the humble grain, proof that resilience often begins in the smallest forms of life, the ones that ask for little, yet give endlessly in return. While many civilizations turned away from the crawling and buzzing life around them, indigenous nomads looked closer and saw abundance. To them, insects were not pests, but partners in survival, offering protein, fat, and essential nutrients when larger game was scarce. In the harshest seasons, the small became mighty. Grasshoppers, crickets, ants, and larvae were gathered with care and respect, roasted over embers, or ground into fine meal. These foods were lightweight, easy to store, and surprisingly rich, capable of sustaining long migrations across unforgiving terrain. When the snow sealed rivers and herds moved on, a single pouch of roasted grasshopper meal could mean the difference between hunger and endurance. Each region had its own expertise. Desert nomads harvested mesquite-dwelling insects that thrived even in drought, while forest travelers collected bee larvae or termites hidden inside fallen logs. Nothing was wasted. Even the wings of grasshoppers were repurposed as kindling, their scent mixing with the smoke that marked campfires across the plains. The practice wasn't random. It was ecological understanding in motion. The nomads knew that insects multiplied quickly and replenished easily, making them a renewable food source that demanded little from the land. They harvested selectively, leaving enough behind to ensure balance, embodying a respect for cycles that modern sustainability movements strive to rediscover. To the untrained eye, these foods might have seemed humble, but to those who understood, they represented adaptation perfected, nourishment born from observation, not domination. When storms raged and supplies ran low, the hum of the land itself became a promise of life. The buzzing fields, the hidden nests, the whispering soil, all offered what the earth always gives to those who listen: enough. For the ancient indigenous nomads, survival wasn't just about finding food, it was about keeping it. They lived in landscapes where seasons swung from plenty to famine, where a feast could fade into scarcity overnight. To endure, they mastered the art of preservation, a quiet science of patience, precision, and respect for what the earth provided. Drying was their first defense against decay. Strips of meat were laid across wooden racks or sun-warmed stones, kissed by wind and smoke until every drop of moisture was gone. What remained was light, portable, and nearly immortal. The foundation for travel rations like pemmican, a blend of dried meat, berries, and fat that could last for months without spoiling. A single bite carried the strength of the hunt and the sweetness of summer, bound together in perfect balance. Roots, fruits, and fungi received the same care. They were sliced thin and dried near slow-burning fires, their nutrients locked in by the gentlest heat. Seeds were roasted and sealed in hide pouches lined with sap. Even fish were preserved through smoke and salt from natural mineral deposits, nature's own preservative gifts. But beyond technique lay philosophy. Preservation was not hoarding, it was gratitude. It honored the understanding that every harvest was temporary, and that waste was a betrayal of effort. Food was stored not for greed, but for continuity, a promise that no storm or drought would silence the heartbeat of the people. These methods, born of necessity, created one of humanity's earliest sustainable food systems. No chemicals, no machines, only wisdom. To the nomads, every preserved meal was more than nourishment. It was time itself, captured and carried forward. Proof that knowledge, like food, is meant to last. For indigenous nomads, movement wasn't aimless wandering. It was choreography with the seasons. Every step of their migration followed the heartbeat of the land, tracing where food emerged, ripened, and rested. They didn't travel to escape scarcity. They traveled to stay in rhythm with abundance. Each landscape offered its own invitation. When rivers thawed, fish returned, and families followed. When berries ripened in mountain valleys, camps shifted uphill. When the plains turned golden with seed-bearing grasses, they moved again, collecting the harvest before frost returned. Their paths were memory maps, marked not by roads, but by flavors and cycles of renewal. Food guided every decision: where to settle, when to move, and how to share. These migrations weren't chaotic. They were carefully timed networks of trade and cooperation. One group might arrive as another departed, leaving behind dried roots, seed caches, or tools. Silent exchanges that kept balance among neighboring bands. Cooking fires became the heart of each new camp, simple yet ingenious. Flat stones served as griddles. Clay-lined pits turned into slow ovens. Woven baskets were filled with hot stones to boil soups without metal. These traveling kitchens adapted to every environment, proving that the true genius of survival wasn't permanence, but flexibility. Through constant movement, the nomads ensured no land was overused and no resource was taken for granted. Their journeys were not escapes from hardship, but acts of stewardship, living proof that mobility and respect could coexist. Wherever they went, they left little behind except footprints and ash, reminders that the earth was both their table and their teacher. To them, movement wasn't restlessness. It was wisdom in motion, the understanding that to live with the land, one must follow its rhythm, not force it. For the ancient indigenous nomads, food was never a solitary act. It was a circle. Every meal carried meaning, every bite a reminder of connection. In a world where survival depended on unity, the act of eating became ceremony, a celebration of balance between people, land, and spirit. When the day's foraging or hunting was done, the camp came alive. Fires glowed against the darkening horizon, and the scent of roasted roots and seeds mingled with wood smoke. Elders shared stories as food passed from hand to hand, teaching through memory rather than lecture. Children learned not only where food came from, but why it mattered, that taking from the land was an agreement, not a right. Meals were shared evenly, guided by an unspoken rule of reciprocity. No one ate until everyone had enough. Hunters gave to gatherers, and gatherers repaid the hunters with stored roots and dried fruit. This exchange wasn't charity. It was the rhythm of survival. It ensured that no single person stood apart from the community that sustained them. Certain foods held ceremonial weight. Seeds were offered back to the earth before planting. The first catch of the season was shared with elders as a gesture of gratitude. Festivals of renewal marked the end of harsh winters, where feasting became both survival and prayer. A reaffirmation of harmony between the seen and unseen worlds. Around those fires, the nomads built something deeper than shelter or sustenance. They built belonging. Food bound them together across generations, turning necessity into ritual and nourishment into unity. For them, the meal wasn't just the end of the journey. It was the reminder that no one truly survives alone, that every grain, every root, every shared bowl carries the story of us. Modern science is only beginning to understand what ancient indigenous nomads already knew, that true nutrition isn't about quantity, but quality, balance, and relationship with the land. Their diets, forged through centuries of trial and wisdom, were remarkably complete, rich in vitamins, minerals, protein, and healthy fats long before laboratories existed to define them. By combining roots, seeds, and animal sources, they achieved a balance that modern nutritionists now call optimal sustenance. Wild tubers offered complex carbohydrates for lasting energy. Insects and game supplied lean proteins and essential fats. Seeds and nuts provided vital minerals and omega-rich oils. Even fungi and fermented foods introduced probiotics that kept digestion strong through seasonal change. The wisdom of ancient indigenous nomads isn't buried in the past. It's waiting patiently for us to remember. In a world overwhelmed by processed abundance and disconnected from the land, their way of living offers a quiet but urgent lesson. Sustainability begins with respect. They didn't take more than they needed. They moved with the seasons, allowing ecosystems to recover. They preserved what they gathered and shared what they had. Every choice, from how they cooked to how they migrated, reflected an understanding that survival depends on balance, not consumption. They lived within the Earth's rhythm, not above it. Their foods, humble roots, seeds, insects, and fungi, may seem simple to us, but they represent something profound: adaptability. These people thrived in deserts, forests, tundra, and plains because they learned to listen before they acted. They watched how nature stored, nourished, and renewed itself, then mirrored those lessons in their own lives. Modern societies, in contrast, have forgotten this rhythm. We rely on endless supply chains, artificial abundance, and wasteful habits that the land cannot sustain forever. But the answers aren't lost. They're still in the soil, the seeds, the wind, and the traditions of those who walked before us. To honor their legacy is not just to study it, but to live it. To eat mindfully, to share freely, and to care deeply for the world that feeds us. The forgotten foods that sustained the nomads were more than survival tools. They were symbols of harmony, gratitude, and intelligence. And if we let their wisdom guide us, we might rediscover the same truth they lived by, that the earth will always provide, as long as we remember how to listen.